The 80s were a big decade for anthology shows. You know, those series where every episode it's a different story with new characters.
Absolutely perfect.
Typically, the only thing that's the same each week is the host.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
This format really peaked in the 80s. At the time, it might have seemed like anthology shows were to the 80s what variety shows were to the 70s.
I'm not interested in your ears. Say, Leonard, what happened to the points?
Anytime you have a trend, it will eventually fizzle. But right now, we're going to look at a forgotten footnote when Steve Martin tried to make an anthology show that was funny. This is Anthology of Anthology TV Shows. 1985 was the height of the anthology TV craze. In that one year, CBS brought back The Twilight Zone.
Big mine, medium rare.
NBC rebooted Alfred Hitchcock Presents. HBO classed things up with the Ray Bradbury Theater.
And the trip? Exactly one half exhilaration, exactly one half terror.
And HBO provided gratuitous nudity and violence with The Hitchhiker. So why were there so many of these shows in 1985? You can blame one man, Steven Spielberg. He was the hottest director in Hollywood, making one blockbuster after another. His movies were big cinematic events that appealed to viewers of all ages. And they made big money. In 1982, E.T. was the highest-grossing movie of all time. 2 years later, Spielberg announced his next project, an adventure series for NBC titled Amazing Stories. The anthology format makes sense for Spielberg. He was a huge fan of the original Twilight Zone. One of his first films was penned by a Twilight Zone writer, Richard Matheson. Spielberg even directed one of the segments in the Twilight Zone movie.
Fresh, young minds.
And his first professional directing job was for a segment of Rod Serling's Night Gallery.
It's simply not fair!
Not only did the 22-year-old direct Joan Crawford, he also got a heart-wrenching performance out of Tom Bosley.
I'll still be able to cry out of them, won't I?
So Amazing Stories was positioned as Spielberg's triumphant return to television, delivering astonishing tales for children of all ages. Then comes another Steven. In 1985, Steve Martin was one of the biggest names in American comedy, and when he saw Spielberg's announcement, he got a big idea. Martin started pitching a TV project that he called a comedic Twilight Zone. In 1985, Martin admitted he was taking the idea from Spielberg. He explained that there had been a lot of anthology shows, but noted that's never been done with comedy. Footnote, technically, there had been a comedy anthology series.
Love American Style.
And you know the deal with that series, right? Love American Style was a corny comedy show that was also a way for ABC to air pilots that didn't get picked up.
Reduce, reuse, recycle.
One of those recycled pilots aired on Love American Style and went on to become a long-running hit.
Sunday, Monday, happy day.
But that's another video entirely. Anyway, Steve Martin described his idea for doing different comedy stories every week. He said that each episode would feature characters you could never conceive of on a weekly basis. To be clear, these wouldn't be comedy sketches, but fully realized worlds that viewers would visit for 30 minutes each week. A vividly imagined short story for television. For example, in one episode, Catherine O'Hara plays a mental patient with multiple personalities.
You work here, right?
Yeah. Well, it depends on your amp, your preamp, your speaker setup.
In another, Martin Mull stars as a mob accountant who goes into witness protection, living in a family with other informants.
Oh, don't ask me. I just got here.
Then you've got Dave Thomas and a pre-Perfect Strangers Bronson Pinchot as Soviet cosmonauts who crash land in Las Vegas. None of these concepts could be sustained week after week, but as televised short stories, they work. Of course, some wouldn't work as well as others.
Very funny.
Piscopo should have stuck with playing Sinatra.
Let's not fight.
Regardless, Martin's pitch was approved and CBS agreed to make 13 episodes. Steve Martin would produce the series alongside Carl Gottlieb, who is best known as the screenwriter for Jaws.
We never had that kind of trouble in these waters.
And don't forget, Gottlieb had a strong comedy background as a member of the legendary improv troupe The Committee,
Howdy out there, America.
where he performed alongside counterculture comics like Howard Hessman and Rob Reiner. Plus, Carl Gottlieb co-wrote The Jerk. You might remember his cameo in the film as Iron Balls McGinty. Martin and Gottlieb had known each other from their early days of working on variety shows like the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Over a decade later, the two were producing their own comedy show for CBS, the same network that canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Now, Steve Martin told CBS he didn't want to appear on camera. Fair enough. So who would host this new series brimming with up-and-coming comedic talent? It would call for someone hip. Someone like George Burns. George Burns made a comeback in the 80s thanks to a series of movies where he played God. And the first Oh God movie was directed by Carl Reiner, who was friends with Steve Martin. So I guess Carl Reiner helped George Burns get the hosting gig.
Every week it'll be someone different. Except for me. I stay the same.
The show was titled The George Burns Comedy Week. And the opening credits suggested that these new shorts were a throwback to the golden age of comedy, with George Burns personally bridging the gap from yesteryear to today. In reality, George Burns had very little input on the show. On the original Twilight Zone, Rod Serling wrote nearly 70% of the scripts. Alfred Hitchcock didn't just present his series, he also directed 17 episodes. Here, George Burns was simply the host. But even that's a lot to ask of an 89-year-old.
At my age, getting up in the morning is dangerous.
The cast and the crew did the heavy lifting. These episodes had an incredible roster. It's like fantasy football for comedy nerds. The actors included Paul Reiser, Howard Hessman, Don Rickles, and Michael McKean.
You're gonna have so much fun you won't believe it.
The writers included Merrill Markoe, Bruce J. Friedman, and Andy Breckman. If you recognize those names, you might be a comedy nerd. And the directors were just as impressive. You had John Landis of Animal House fame, of course Carl Gottlieb, who directed Caveman and would go on to co-direct Amazon Women on the Moon, and Neil Israel, who made Real Genius and Bachelor Party. Hard to believe this series was never released on home video. So what was a typical episode like? My favorite entry is called Home for Dinner. Eugene Levy plays a guy who moves his family from New York City to the suburbs, and they just don't fit in.
White shoes.
This sounds a little like Schitt's Creek, but trust me, it goes somewhere else entirely. Levy goes to a backyard barbecue and gets invited on a fishing trip. He reluctantly accepts, but here's the twist.
We are going hunting.
They're flying to San Carlos to hunt a criminal mastermind.
You three guys are gonna capture the most wanted, the most dangerous criminal in the world. There are three guys, Bob. Us four guys. Here. Bulletproof.
From there, it's a very 80s premise where the suburban dads are in combat, still being suburban dads.
Will you look at this? Not a single weed in Whiteland's grass.
Yes, these guys were the original suburban commandos. In the end, Levy gets kidnapped by the villain, gets shot by the villain, and like Michael Douglas in Falling Down, he's finally had enough. I assume. I haven't seen Falling Down. I've only seen the trailer. The boys fly back to the USA where government agents tie up any loose ends and provide a good cover story. When the men go home, it's a classic don't tell the wife scenario. Again, this premise would not hold up as a weekly sitcom, but as a standalone story, it works great. Another noteworthy episode is The Couch. It's one of Steve Martin's only directing credits, and watching this, I wish he directed more. This installment stars Harvey Korman and Valerie Perrine as a nouveau riche couple who want to make a good impression because their daughter is about to marry into old money. So they go to an auction where they bid on a fancy couch.
We have 18,000.
And, as the saying goes, hilarity ensues. Except I mean it. This really is a funny episode. It's got physical comedy, social satire,
Do you know how they're getting to the wedding? They are boating to the wedding. Do you know how they're boating to the wedding? They are boating to the wedding in their own yacht.
plus the supporting cast includes Michael J. Pollard,
Me? Yeah, you with the tux. Over here, please. Sure.
Bronson Pinchot,
This is like an insanity asylum.
and Carrie Fisher as a bridezilla. Footnote: in one scene, Leo is arguing with some delivery men, and it might be one of television's first examples of the "you people" joke.
Don't you understand plain English? What's wrong with you people?
What do you mean, you people?
And what is it with you people?
You people.
Ooh, you people.
What's with you people? What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
But no surprise, All in the Family did it first.
See, that's the trouble with you people. You always think that...
Who are you calling you people? You people are you people.
End of footnote. Believe it or not, 1 year later, The Couch became its own series.
On the road to high society, they took a wrong turn. Premiering April 25th, Leo and Liz in Beverly Hills.
And the first episode was directed by Steve Martin. Harvey Korman seemed fond of his work on the show.
And I thought we had some pretty good stories, and I think we had a nice relationship, Valerie and myself, and we had some nice subsidiary characters. And I thought I was pretty good, and everybody hated it.
Yes, despite doing an episode with guest star Liberace, Leo and Liz in Beverly Hills was canceled after only 6 episodes, proving Steve Martin's point that these anthology stories would not work in a weekly format. Today, the spinoff is barely remembered, but it was part of another trend: movies and TV shows about Beverly Hills. In the end, the battle between the two Steves ended poorly for Steve Martin. NBC renewed Amazing Stories for a second season, while CBS canceled the George Burns Comedy Week.
Bye-bye. See you next time.
But George Burns outlasted both series. He went on to reach the age of 100, which makes him the oldest person to host an anthology show. Or does it?
Care for another drink? Or should I just put a head on this one?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to Atomic Abe, hit the notification bell, and watch our other videos about anthology TV shows, like our look at 3 different series hosted by Orson Welles.
You'll have a chance to solve the crime.